It was an ordinary afternoon in the small town of Brookdale, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, or at least thinks they do. Officer Mark Taylor, a veteran cop with a reputation for being by the book, was out on patrol, scanning the quiet streets for anything out of the ordinary. He wasn't expecting much. Brookdale rarely saw any real action, but then his radio crackled with a report that made him sit up straight in his cruiser. A young girl had been spotted near the edge of the park, alone and acting suspicious. The call was vague, but Mark knew he had to check it out. As he pulled up, he saw her. Just a kid, no older than 9, with curly hair tied back in a ponytail, sitting on a bench and staring at the ground. She didn't look dangerous, but she was definitely out of place. Mark approached her cautiously, his hand hovering near his belt. "Hey there, kid," he called out. "What are you doing out here by yourself?" The girl looked up at him, startled. Her eyes were wide, and she clutched a small backpack to her chest like it held all her secrets. "I'm just waiting," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark didn't want to scare her, but something about the situation didn't sit right with him. "Waiting for who?" he asked, his tone firm but not unkind. The girl hesitated, glancing around nervously, before muttering, "My dad." "Your dad?" Mark pressed. "What's his name?" When she answered, it stopped him cold. "Chief Anderson." Mark froze, his mind racing. Chief Anderson was the town's police chief, a man of authority, respect, and integrity. He'd never mentioned having a daughter, let alone one this young. But before Mark could process what she'd said, the girl stood up, clutching her backpack tighter. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "You can call him if you want." Mark's training kicked in. He couldn't just take her word for it. Protocol was protocol, even if the story sounded unbelievable. He radioed in the situation, and within moments, things escalated. The girl was handcuffed, not because she was dangerous, but because Mark didn't know what else to do. It was standard procedure for detaining someone, no matter their age or the oddity of the circumstances. But as the girl sat in the backseat of his cruiser, silent tears streaming down her face, Mark couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he'd made a terrible mistake. And that's when his phone rang. The voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Officer Taylor, this is Chief Anderson. What the hell are you doing with my daughter?" Mark's heart sank. Before he could explain, the chief cut him off. "You better pray nothing happens to her in the next 7 minutes. I'm on my way." The next moments unfolded like a nightmare. Strange calls started coming in on the radio, distress signals, one after another. The kind of chaos Brookdale never experienced. And then Mark heard it, a panicked, trembling voice over the airwaves. "This is Chief Anderson. I need backup. Now." What happened next would leave Officer Taylor questioning everything he thought he knew about duty, justice, and what it really means to protect and serve. Stay tuned. This story is just getting started. Would you like me to expand on this or refine any part? Mark Taylor sat frozen in the front seat of his cruiser, Chief Anderson's words still ringing in his ears. The air felt heavy, the kind of weight that told him he was in deep trouble. The little girl, Chief Anderson's daughter, sat quietly in the backseat, her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized seatbelt. She wasn't crying anymore, but the tear stains on her cheeks told their own story. Mark could feel her eyes on him, piercing and unforgiving. He glanced at the clock on his dashboard. 7 minutes. That was how long the chief had given him before he arrived. 7 minutes to figure out what had gone so horribly wrong. Mark tried to calm his racing mind, but every scenario he conjured made him feel worse. What was a 9-year-old doing out here alone? Why hadn't Chief Anderson mentioned he had a daughter? And most importantly, why had he, Mark, handcuffed her like a criminal? He picked up his radio and called dispatch. "This is Officer Taylor," he said, his voice steady but tight. "I need confirmation on a missing person report for Chief Anderson's daughter. Anything in the system." There was a pause, the kind that made his stomach drop. Then the dispatcher's voice came through, confused and hesitant. Negative, Officer Taylor. No reports on file for the chief's family. Are you sure it's his daughter? Mark glanced in the rearview mirror at the girl, who was staring blankly out the window. Her small hands gripped the edge of the seat. She says she is, he replied quietly. What about unusual activity near Brookdale Park in the past hour? Any reports? Another pause. This time, the dispatcher sounded almost nervous. Just your call, officer. But we've been getting a lot of strange chatter on the emergency line. Distress signals, but the calls keep dropping before we can get details. Seems unrelated. Unrelated? Mark wasn't so sure. Something about this whole situation felt off, like he'd stepped into a story that didn't belong to him. He thought about the chief's voice on the phone, sharp, furious, but laced with something else. Fear. Mark took a deep breath and turned in his seat to face the girl. Look, he began, trying to soften his tone. I need to understand what's going on. Can you help me out? Why were you sitting there by yourself? The girl didn't respond at first. She kept her gaze on the window, as if willing herself to disappear. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. I was waiting for my dad. He said he'd come back. Mark frowned. Come back from where? She shook her head. I don't know. He just told me to wait there. But he never came back. There was something in her tone, a tremor that hinted at more than just fear. It was almost as if she didn't believe her own words. Mark tried to piece it together. Why would the chief leave his daughter alone in a park? That wasn't just unusual, it was unthinkable. Before he could ask another question, his radio crackled to life. This time, the voice wasn't from dispatch. It was the chief. Officer Taylor. Chief Anderson barked, his voice strained and frantic. Where are you right now? Mark fumbled with the radio, suddenly feeling like a rookie on his first day. I'm still at the park, sir, he replied. Your daughter is with me. She's safe. The chief's response came fast and sharp. Good, stay there. Do not move. I'm 2 minutes out. 2 minutes. Mark's pulse quickened. He didn't like how the chief sounded, like a man fighting off panic. And then, almost as an afterthought, the chief added, and Taylor, don't let anyone else near her. No one. Mark's grip tightened on the radio. Sir, is there something I should know? What's going on? But the line went dead. Mark stared at the radio, his mind racing. The chief's words hung in the air like a warning. Don't let anyone else near her. Why? Who would want to hurt a 9-year-old girl? He looked back at her again, and for the first time, he noticed something he hadn't before, a faint bruise on her wrist, just under the edge of her sleeve. His chest tightened. Hey, kid, he said gently. Did someone hurt you? The girl flinched at the question but didn't answer. Instead, she pulled her backpack closer to her chest, as if it were a shield. Mark's eyes narrowed. Whatever was in that bag, it mattered to her a lot. Before he could press further, headlights appeared at the far end of the parking lot. A black SUV sped toward them, kicking up gravel as it screeched to a stop a few feet away. The driver's door flew open, and out stepped Chief Anderson. Mark had never seen the chief like this before, disheveled, wide-eyed, and visibly shaken. He stormed toward the cruiser, his gaze locked on his daughter. Mark stepped out to meet him, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Chief, I. But the chief didn't let him finish. Open the door, he snapped, his voice breaking. Now. Mark obeyed, fumbling with the keys as he unlocked the back door. The girl scrambled out, and the moment she was free, she ran straight into her father's arms. He knelt down, holding her tight, whispering something Mark couldn't hear. For a brief moment, Mark felt a pang of relief. Whatever had gone wrong, at least the girl was safe. But then the chief stood up, his face dark with anger. Taylor, he said, his voice low and dangerous. What the hell were you thinking, putting her in handcuffs? Mark opened his mouth to explain, but before he could, the chief held up a hand. Save it. We don't have time for this. Get in your car and follow me, now. Mark hesitated. Sir, can you just tell me what's going on? I think I deserve to know. The chief shot him a look that made his blood run cold. What's going on, he said slowly, is bigger than you, me, or this entire town. And if we don't move now, none of it's going to matter. Mark didn't argue. He climbed back into his cruiser, his mind spinning. As the chief's SUV peeled out of the lot, Mark followed close behind, the girl's frightened face still etched in his mind. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over. And Mark had a feeling it was about to get a whole lot worse. Mark's cruiser trailed the chief's SUV down the dark, winding roads of Brookdale. The only sound inside his vehicle was the steady hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of his radio. He glanced at the dashboard clock. It had been nearly 20 minutes since they'd left the park, and the chief still hadn't said where they were going. Every turn they took seemed to lead them further from The chief took a deep breath, his eyes dark. There's a pattern to it. Every time someone gets close to figuring out what's happening, something stops them. One of my officers went to check out a call last week, a report of strange noises near the old quarry. He didn't come back. When we found his car, the engine was running, but he was gone. No sign of a struggle, no tracks, nothing. Mark's pulse quickened. And you think this has something to do with your daughter? I don't just think, Taylor. I know. The chief's voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed the fear he was trying to hide. She's the key to all of this. I don't know how or why, but whatever's happening, it's centered on her. Before Mark could respond, a low rustling sound came from the trees. The girl stiffened, clutching her father's arm. The chief's hand instinctively went to his holster, and Mark followed suit, his heart pounding. Stay close, the chief whispered. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by a faint, almost metallic hum. Mark scanned the tree line, his eyes straining against the darkness. For a moment, everything was still. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't human, at least, not entirely. It moved with an unnatural grace, its elongated limbs glinting faintly in the moonlight. Its eyes, or what looked like eyes, glowed with an eerie pale light. Mark's breath caught in his throat. What the hell is that? The chief didn't answer. Instead, he stepped in front of his daughter, his gun drawn and steady. Taylor, he said quietly, get her in the car, now. Mark didn't need to be told twice. He moved quickly, scooping up the girl and carrying her toward the cruiser. She clung to him tightly, her small hands trembling against his uniform. Behind them, the chief stood his ground, his gun trained on the figure. But as Mark reached the car, he heard the chief's voice, a mix of anger and desperation. Stay back, the chief shouted. I'm warning you. Mark shoved the girl into the back seat and slammed the door shut. He turned to see the figure advancing, its movements slow but deliberate. The metallic hum grew louder, reverberating through the air. Chief, Mark yelled, get in the car. But the chief didn't move. He stood frozen, his eyes locked on the figure. For a moment, Mark thought he saw something shift in the chief's expression, fear giving way to something else. Recognition. Chief, Mark shouted again, his voice cracking. Finally, the chief turned and ran toward the cruiser, his face pale and drawn. He jumped into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel. Buckle up, he said sharply. Mark barely had time to climb into the passenger seat before the SUV roared to life and tore down the service road. The metallic hum faded behind them, but the sense of dread lingered heavy and suffocating. Mark glanced at the chief, whose knuckles were white against the steering wheel. What was that? The chief didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, but his expression said it all. Whatever they were up against, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The SUV sped down the empty road, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Inside, the air was thick with tension, each second dragging out like an eternity. Mark could hear the girl's shaky breaths from the backseat and the occasional sniffle as she tried to hold back tears. He wanted to say something, anything to comfort her, but his own thoughts were too scrambled to form words. Instead, he glanced at Chief Anderson, whose face was set in a mask of grim determination. "Chief, we need to talk about what just happened," Mark finally said, his voice low but urgent. "That thing, whatever it wasn't human. You know that, don't you?" The chief's hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white. "I know," he said flatly, not taking his eyes off the road. "And I don't have answers for you, Taylor. All I know is that it's been following us, watching us. It's not the first time I've seen it." Mark's heart pounded. "You've seen it before. When?" "Last night," the chief admitted, his voice strained. "It was outside my house. It didn't come closer, just stood there in the shadows, watching. But I could feel it. It wanted something or someone." Mark turned to look at the girl in the back seat. She was staring out the window, her small hands clutching her backpack like it was the only thing keeping her safe. "You think it wants her," Mark said quietly. The chief didn't respond, but his silence was answer enough. Mark felt a cold knot of fear tighten in his chest. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just about the girl. It was about what she knew, what she carried, or what she was connected to. "Where are we going?" Mark asked, trying to focus on the immediate. The chief hesitated before answering. "There's an old cabin in the woods, about 5 miles from here. It used to belong to my father. It's isolated. Mark wasn't convinced. "And what if that thing follows us? What if it finds us there?" The chief glanced at him, his eyes hard. "Then we make a stand." The words sent a chill through Mark. He'd been a cop long enough to know when someone was preparing for a fight, they didn't expect to win. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered gun. Whatever was coming, he wasn't sure his training had prepared him for it. The road narrowed as they entered the woods, the trees crowding in on either side like silent sentinels. The girl suddenly spoke, her voice small but clear. "It's not going to stop." Both men turned to look at her. She was still staring out the window, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" the chief asked gently, though his voice betrayed a tremor. She held her backpack tighter. "It's not going to stop until it gets what it wants." Mark exchanged a worried glance with the chief. "And what does it want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl hesitated, her eyes darting to the backpack. "I don't know," she said finally, though the uncertainty in her voice made Mark suspect she knew more than she was letting on. The cabin came into view moments later, a small weathered structure tucked into the trees. The chief pulled the SUV to a stop, and they all climbed out. The woods were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, oppressive. Mark's hand stayed on his gun as they made their way inside. The cabin was sparse but sturdy, its walls lined with old hunting gear and faded photographs. The chief moved quickly, checking the windows and bolting the door. "We'll be safe here," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Mark wasn't so sure. He turned to the girl, who had settled into a chair, her backpack still clutched in her lap. "Kid," he said gently, crouching down to her level. "You've got to tell us what's in that bag. If it's connected to all this, we need to know." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and defiance. "It's mine," she said firmly. "I can't let anyone take it." Mark sighed, glancing at the chief. "We don't have time for secrets," he said. "Whatever's out there, it's not going to wait." The chief nodded, kneeling beside his daughter. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "you can trust us. We're trying to protect you. Please, let us help." The girl hesitated, her fingers tightening around the straps of the backpack. For a moment, Mark thought she was going to refuse again, but then slowly she unzipped it. Inside was a small weathered notebook, its edges frayed with age. The chief reached for it, but the girl pulled it back. "You can look," she said, her voice trembling, "but you have to promise not to take it away." The chief nodded, his hands steady as he took the notebook and opened it. Mark leaned over, his curiosity piqued. The pages were filled with symbols and drawings, strange and intricate, interspersed with notes written in a language neither of them recognized. "What is this?" Mark asked, his voice hushed. The girl swallowed hard. "It was my mom's," she said quietly. "She told me to keep it safe. She said it was important." Mark's breath caught. He'd never heard the chief talk about his wife, and he realized now why. The pain in the chief's eyes was unmistakable as he stared at the notebook. Before anyone could say more, a loud crash echoed outside. All three of them froze, their eyes darting toward the door. The metallic hum from earlier had returned, louder and more oppressive than before. Mark pulled his gun, his heart racing. "Chief," he said urgently, "we've got company." The chief stood, his jaw clenched. "Get her into the back room," he ordered, his voice sharp. "Now." Mark grabbed the girl's hand, pulling her toward the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. She didn't protest, but he could feel her trembling. He closed the door behind them, his gun still in hand, and crouched by the window to peer outside. The shadows in the woods seemed to move, shifting and twisting in unnatural ways. The hum grew louder, reverberating through the walls of the cabin. Mark's grip on his gun tightened. In the other room, he heard the chief shouting, "Whatever you are, you're not getting her. Do you hear me? You're not taking her." And then the windows shattered. The sound of shattering glass was deafening. Mark flinched, his instincts screaming for him to protect the girl as shards rained down into the cabin's main room. The humming outside rose to an almost unbearable pitch, vibrating through the walls and into the floor. Mark pressed the girl close to him, shielding her with his body as his heart pounded wildly. Both men turned to look at her. She was still staring out the window, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" the chief asked gently, though his voice betrayed a tremor. She hugged her backpack tighter. "It's not going to stop until it gets what it wants." Mark exchanged a worried glance with the chief. "And what does it want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl hesitated, her eyes darting to the backpack. "I don't know," she said finally, though the uncertainty in her voice made Mark suspect she knew more than she was letting on. The cabin came into view moments later, a small weathered structure tucked into the trees. The chief pulled the SUV to a stop, and they all climbed out. The woods were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, oppressive. Mark's hand stayed on his gun as they made their way inside. The cabin was sparse but sturdy, its walls lined with old hunting gear and faded photographs. The chief moved quickly, checking the windows and bolting the door. "We'll be safe here," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Mark wasn't so sure. He turned to the girl, who had settled into a chair, her backpack still clutched in her lap. "Kid," he said gently, crouching down to her level, "you've got to tell us what's in that bag. If it's connected to all this, we need to know." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and defiance. "It's mine," she said firmly. "I can't let anyone take it." Mark sighed, glancing at the chief. "We don't have time for secrets," he said. "Whatever's out there, it's not going to wait." The chief nodded, kneeling beside his daughter. "Sweetheart," he said softly, "you can trust us. We're trying to protect you. Please let us help." The girl hesitated, her fingers tightening around the straps of the backpack. For a moment, Mark thought she was going to refuse again, but then slowly she unzipped it. Inside was a small, weathered notebook, its edges frayed with age. The chief reached for it, but the girl pulled it back. "You can look," she said, her voice trembling. "But you have to promise not to take it away." The chief nodded, his hands steady as he took the notebook and opened it. Mark leaned over, his curiosity piqued. The pages were filled with symbols and drawings, strange and intricate, interspersed with notes written in a language neither of them recognized. "What is this?" Mark asked, his voice hushed. The girl swallowed hard. "It was my mom's," she said quietly. "She told me to keep it safe. She said it was important." Mark's breath caught. He'd never heard the chief talk about his wife, and he realized now why. The pain in the chief's eyes was unmistakable as he stared at the notebook. Before anyone could say more, a loud crash echoed outside. All three of them froze, their eyes darting toward the door. The metallic hum from earlier had returned, louder and more oppressive than before. Mark pulled his gun, his heart racing. "Chief," he said urgently, "we've got company." The chief stood, his jaw clenched. "Get her into the back room," he ordered, his voice sharp. "Now." Mark grabbed the girl's hand, pulling her toward the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. She didn't protest, but he could feel her trembling. He closed the door behind them, his gun still in hand, and crouched by the window to peer outside. The shadows in the woods seemed to move, shifting and twisting in unnatural ways. The hum grew louder, reverberating through the walls of the cabin. Mark's grip on his gun tightened. In the other room, he heard the chief shouting, "Whatever you are, you're not getting her. Do you hear me? You're not taking her." And then the windows shattered. The sound of shattering glass was deafening. Mark flinched, his instincts screaming for him to protect the girl as shards rained down into the cabin's main room. The humming outside rose to an almost unbearable pitch, vibrating through the walls and into the floor. Mark pressed the girl close to him, shielding her with his body as his heart pounded wildly. Plus, she held the notebook out to him, flipping it open to a page filled with intricate drawings. "There are more," she said, "and they're coming." Mark's grip on the wheel tightened. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness, and for the first time, he realized just how unprepared they were. This wasn't just about one strange creature or even the girl. It was bigger than that, much bigger. As if on cue, the hum returned, louder and more oppressive than before. Mark's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and his heart sank. In the distance, shadows moved. Too many to count, all of them closing in. The girl's voice cut through the silence, steady despite the fear in her eyes. "They're not going to stop." Mark nodded, his jaw set. "Then we don't stop either." But deep down, he knew they were running out of road, and the real fight was only just beginning. The SUV tore through the winding forest road, its tires kicking up dust and gravel as Mark pushed the vehicle to its limit. The oppressive hum grew louder, resonating in his chest like a drumbeat of impending doom. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, growing closer, faster. He knew they couldn't outrun them forever. In the back seat, the girl clutched the notebook tightly, her face pale but determined. She whispered something under her breath, words Mark couldn't make out over the roar of the engine and the relentless hum. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his voice urgent. "What are you saying? Is it something from the book?" She looked up, her eyes locking with his. "It's what my mom used to say. She told me it would protect us if the time ever came." Mark's stomach twisted. "And what time is that?" The girl hesitated, then answered with a chilling certainty. "When they come to take what's ours." Mark didn't have time to process her words. Up ahead, the road split into two paths, one veering sharply left toward a narrow bridge, the other leading deeper into the woods. He made a split-second decision, swerving left. The bridge came into view, rickety and old, spanning a deep ravine. "They're going to follow us," the girl said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Mark nodded grimly. "Then we make sure they can't." He pressed harder on the gas, the SUV barreling onto the bridge with a thunderous rattle. The wooden planks groaned under the weight, and Mark could feel the structure's instability. Behind them, the shadows poured out of the forest, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness as they closed in. The girl suddenly leaned forward, clutching his arm. "Stop the car." "What? Are you crazy?" Mark shouted, his voice filled with panic. "Trust me," she said, her tone firm and resolute. Mark hesitated, but the urgency in her voice left no room for argument. He slammed on the brakes, the SUV skidding to a stop in the middle of the bridge. The girl climbed into the front seat, opening the notebook and flipping through its pages with frantic speed. "What are you doing?" Mark demanded, his eyes darting between her and the approaching shadows. She didn't answer, her focus entirely on the symbols and notes in the book. Finally, she found what she was looking for, a page filled with intricate patterns and a single phrase written in bold, slanted handwriting. She placed her hand on the page and began to speak the words aloud, her voice steady but rising with intensity. The air around them shifted, growing colder and heavier. The hum faltered, replaced by a low, vibrating tone that seemed to emanate from the book itself. The shadows on the bridge slowed, their movements becoming erratic, as if something unseen was holding them back. Mark watched in stunned silence as a faint, shimmering barrier began to form around the SUV, its edges glowing with an otherworldly light. The shadows recoiled, their distorted forms twisting and writhing as they tried to breach the barrier. "What is this?" Mark whispered, his voice filled with awe and fear. The girl didn't answer, her focus unwavering as she continued to recite the words. The barrier grew stronger, pulsing with energy, but the strain was evident on her face. Her hands trembled and sweat beaded on her forehead. Just as Mark began to hope that they might have a chance, the shadows did something unexpected. Instead of retreating, they began to merge, their individual forms combining into a single massive entity. Its eyes burned brighter, and its movements became deliberate, calculated. It slammed against the barrier with a force that shook the bridge, cracks splintering through the wooden planks. "We can't hold this," Mark shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. The girl's voice faltered for a moment, but she kept going, her determination unwavering. "I can stop it," she said through gritted teeth, "but I need your help." Mark didn't hesitate. "What do I do?" She pointed to the notebook, her finger resting on a series of symbols. "You have to draw these on the bridge. It's the only way to break the connection." Mark grabbed a piece of chalk from the backpack, something he hadn't noticed until now, and scrambled out of the SUV. The hum was deafening, the massive shadow pounding against the barrier with relentless force. Mark's hands shook as he began to draw the symbols, copying them as precisely as he could. Behind him, the girl's voice grew louder, her words echoing with a power that seemed to resonate through the very fabric of the air. The shadow let out a deafening roar, its form shifting and writhing as if in pain. Mark finished the last symbol just as the barrier flickered and began to collapse. The girl shouted the final phrase, her voice breaking, and a blinding light erupted from the notebook. The shadow let out a final, agonized scream before it was sucked into the light, its massive form disappearing into the void. Silence fell, broken only by the creaking of the bridge and the distant sounds of the forest. Mark stumbled back to the SUV, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The girl sat slumped in the seat, the notebook resting in her lap, its pages now blank. "It's over," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark shook his head, his mind reeling. What just happened? What was that thing? The girl looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and sadness. "It was never after me," she said. "It was after her." Mark froze, confusion washing over him. "Her? Who's her?" The girl didn't answer. Instead, she opened the notebook to reveal a faint image of a woman who looked eerily like the chief's late wife. The realization hit Mark like a punch to the gut. Before he could say anything, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the other side of the bridge. Mark turned, his heart leaping into his throat. Standing there, silhouetted against the moonlight, was the chief, alive but different. His eyes glowed faintly, and a strange, unreadable expression crossed his face. "We need to talk," he said, his voice calm but laced with something Mark couldn't quite place. Mark stared at him, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. Mark stared at the chief, his chest still heaving from the chaos they'd just survived. The faint glow in the chief's eyes sent a shiver down his spine, but it was the man's calm demeanor that unnerved him the most. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, heavy and charged with unspoken tension. "What happened back there?" Mark finally asked, his voice low but firm. And don't give me some vague answer. I think I've earned the truth. The chief stepped closer, his boots crunching softly against the loose gravel of the bridge. He glanced at the girl, who was watching him with equal parts curiosity and caution, then shifted his gaze back to Mark. His shoulders sagged, the weight of whatever he was about to reveal pressing visibly down on him. This all started years ago, the chief began, his voice carrying a deep wariness. Long before you came to this town, before I became chief, it started with my wife. Mark's jaw tightened. He hadn't known the chief's wife well, but her loss had been a wound the town felt deeply. Still, this revelation didn't explain the horrors they had just faced. She wasn't normal, the chief continued, choosing his words carefully. Not in the way people think of normal, anyway. She came from a family that had knowledge of things most people couldn't even comprehend. They called it a gift, but she always saw it as a curse. Mark felt the girl stiffen beside him, clutching the now blank notebook to her chest. The chief's words seemed to resonate with her, as if she'd already suspected this, but had needed confirmation. She tried to leave that part of her life behind, the chief said. But some things don't let go. There were forces tied to her bloodline, ancient and relentless. When she passed, I thought it was over. I thought we were free. Mark's throat tightened. But you weren't. The chief shook his head. No, they've been waiting, watching, and when my daughter started showing signs of the same abilities, they turned their attention to her. Mark glanced at the girl, who sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the chief. She seemed remarkably calm for a child who had just been through so much, but there was a gravity in her expression that made her seem far older than her years. So, what were they? Mark asked. Those things, shadows, or whatever they were. Call them guardians, the chief said grimly. But not the kind that protect. They guard knowledge, power, things humanity was never meant to access. My wife's family had been tethered to them for generations, using their influence but always paying the price. Mark let out a shaky breath, trying to process everything. And tonight, what did they want? Just her? He gestured to the girl. The chief hesitated before nodding. She's the key. They needed her to complete whatever they've been planning for centuries. That's why they've been hunting her. And why I've been doing everything in my power to keep her safe. Mark rubbed his face, exhaustion crashing over him. And the notebook, the symbols, that light, what was all that? It was her mother's, the chief said, his voice softening. A way to channel their power against them. But it's only temporary. They'll come back. They always do. The girl spoke up for the first time since the confrontation on the bridge. Her voice was steady, but there was a hint of sadness in her tone. Then we need to stop them for good. Mark turned to her, startled by her determination. What are you saying, kid? You're just a child. Her gaze was unwavering. I'm not just a child. You saw what I did back there. I can do more. I have to do more. The chief looked pained, torn between his instincts to protect her and the realization that she might be the only one capable of ending this. He knelt down, taking her small hands in his. You're brave, but you don't have to do this alone. Mark felt something stir inside him. He'd been dragged into this mess unwillingly, but now, looking at the girl and the chief, he knew he couldn't walk away. He'd seen too much, been through too much, to pretend he didn't have a stake in this. What's the plan? Mark asked, his voice steady. The chief straightened, a spark of resolve in his eyes. We find their source, the place where their power originates, and we end it. Mark nodded, though the thought of facing those creatures again sent a chill down his spine. And how do we do that? The chief glanced at the girl, who held up the notebook. Though its pages appeared blank now, she seemed certain it still held answers. We follow the clues, she said simply. Mom always said the book would lead the way. The three of them climbed back into the SUV, the weight of their mission settling over them. As they drove away from the battered bridge, the forest began to feel less like a place of terror and more like the starting point of a journey. A dangerous, uncertain journey, but one they had to take. The road ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time, Mark felt a strange sense of hope. They weren't running anymore. They were fighting back. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the girl flipped through the notebook's pages, which now shimmered faintly with symbols Mark couldn't understand. She traced one with her finger, a small smile playing on her lips. "We'll find them," she said confidently. "And when we do, we'll end this." The chief placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his eyes meeting Mark's in the rearview mirror. For the first time that night, Mark saw something in the chief he hadn't expected: trust. Mark tightened his grip on the wheel, his jaw set with determination. They didn't know what lay ahead, but they weren't alone. And together, they were ready to face whatever came next. The road stretched out before them, endless and uncertain, but filled with the promise of a fight worth taking on. And as they disappeared into the morning light, the hum that had haunted them all night was finally, blessedly silent.